Welcome to Who's in STEM. I'm Ken Ono, your host, and the STEM advisor to the provost and the Marvin Rosenblum Professor of Mathematics here at UVA. Now, our goal is to evoke flights of imagination and wonder by showcasing the cornucopia of all that is STEM at UVA, the marvelous world of UVA science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Here on Who's in STEM, we're all about highlighting the good and the great of STEM at UVA. And while this includes areas that might be less obvious to those of you who are very familiar with our grounds with the rotunda, the lawn, and the classic old red brick buildings. And there have been many advances that have been going on off grounds quite far from the lawn that we're going to talk about today. We've talked a little bit about the research that happens at Fontaine Research Park. That's home of the soon-to-be-completed Manning Institute, also home to the Harrison Translational Research Center and others. But in the other direction, out by the airport, out by CHO, there's also been a lot of research that UVA is quite proud of. In fact, while most of us waited at home, struggling during the pandemic, COVID-19, today's guest was busy at work in UVA's Discovery Park, putting together detailed and informative forecasts that inform policymakers who were planning and trying to respond to this deadly pandemic. Professor Madhav Marathe, the executive director of the Biocomplexity Institute and distinguished professor, is here today to talk about some very important work that my guess most of you are unaware of. Madhav, welcome to Who's in STEM.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Ken.
So Madhav, there's a lot that we want to talk about. We've been friends for a number of years. For this episode, I really want to start with a little bit of science, biocomplexity, and the Institute. Tell us about that. What does that mean to someone who's never heard of the Institute?
So biocomplexity, as I see it, refers to the study of living and non-living agents and their ecologies that they live in. Of course, this literally means studying the complexity of life in its all forms, but it also includes non-living agents. AI is a buzzword today, and non-living agents refer to these AI-assisted bots and machines, cars, phones that we all use. They become part of our ecosystem now. We interact with them, they adapt, they respond to us, sometimes in a very simple manner, and sometimes in fairly complicated settings.
So biocomplexity to you means complicated systems where there are agents and entities that must interact in a way that you would study based on the principles of, say, a biological system.
And if I were to take a step forward, using the terminology by Herb Simon, a famous Turing Award and a Nobel Prize winner, he called it the science of the artificial and the science of the natural. And biocomplexity really refers to them coming together.
Right, so it's something like the physicists who talk about the theory of everything, but you can also say the biocomplexity is, in a way, the theory of everything as well.
That's correct. But the emphasis is on agents who can mediate their behavior. And that part sets this particular area of study somewhat apart.
Yeah, so let's talk about the term agent. It's a term that is now quite freely tossed about, in particular in the context of advances in AI. So for you, what does it mean that there are agents? When I was a kid, when I heard agent, I thought of secret spies, right? Special agent such and such. But in our context, what do you mean when you use the term agent?
I think it's an interesting question, and there is an ongoing debate on what agency means. At a minimum, we think of agents as entities that can mediate their own behavior. There are more complicated definitions of agents, where an agent is an autonomous entity, has the ability to respond, has the ability to adapt, and in some cases, people have even talked about replication as being a fundamental property of agent. But I think the minimal definition is an agent is an entity which has the ability to mediate its own behavior.
So tell us a little bit more about the Institute, your pitch.
So the Biocomplexity Institute started here at UVA about 7 years back. And I would like to thank Chris Barrett, who was the founding executive director of the Institute, as well as the university, It was a unique experiment that continues.
So you came to UVA in what year?
In 2018.
2018.
We came here after a stint at Virginia Tech and before that at Los Alamos National Labs. And the Institute really has in its overall genetic imprint all the things we have learned during our move from these places. So the Institute itself studies what I would call grand challenge problems, problems of societal importance, such as how do you respond to pandemics? How do you create sustainable habitats? It takes a unique approach in many ways to solve these problems. First, we study this using what's called a transdisciplinary team science approach. We think these grand challenge problems cannot be solved by a single individual or within the narrow confines of a discipline or a school or a department. In simple terms, transdisciplinary science and team science refers to a study where people come together from different fields and then refine and extend their knowledge and understanding in their own fields to create new knowledge and technologies that advance and create new fields to study these problems. The other unique feature of the Institute is its ability to work on mission-driven science. Science where the questions are given to us by our sponsors, and then we derive fundamental questions of scientific importance.
Such as the COVID
Such
challenge.
as the COVID, or understanding impact of changing climate on human populations and migration. To do this, we need to assemble a large group of scientists and engineers with very different backgrounds, but not just scientists and engineers. Our institute has as many students, undergraduates, graduates, and even high school students.
And the scientists, what sort of fields, how do you find them, and what is their background?
Yeah, this is exciting, right? We have physicists, we have computer scientists, mathematicians, philosophers, economists, cognitive scientists, all coming together to address these problems. As I said, we don't think this grand challenge problems can be solved by any individual or a single academic discipline. The part that has to do with students is important, Ken, here, because I think they drive the science in a particular way. They keep us fresh, they keep us on our toes, and they are always asking us questions that surprisingly turn out to be quite hard to solve in practical world.
So a couple of questions come to mind. I'm a mathematician. I work in a math department full of mathematicians. I don't know what it would be like to be in an environment where you have such broad and diverse kinds of expertise. Madhav, what is your expertise? And I presume that based on your early professional training that you didn't have in mind that you would be working for an institute with philosophers and engineers, so on and so forth. What's your background?
So I was trained as a computer scientist. I did my undergraduate back in India in the Indian Institute of Technology at Chennai. I then came to the U.S. to do my doctoral studies. I was at University at Albany, one of the SUNY universities, and I was very fortunate to be working with four giants in the field of computational complexity theory. Dick Stearns, Harry Hunt, Dan Rosenkrantz, and S.S. Ravi. You very well know that Dick Stearns and Joris Hartmanis went on to win the 1993 Turing Prize for their foundational work in complexity theory. I then went to Los Alamos as a postdoctoral fellow first. And in many ways, I had studied, again in Herb Simon's words, the complexity theory of the artificial, design systems, computers. And here I was starting to study complexity theory of natural and socio-technical systems. Chris Barrett at that time was running a program called Transims at Los Alamos. In many ways, the Transims project reflected his own training at Caltech and in military systems and allowed us to build what we think was a breakthrough technology in urban transport systems.
Mm-hmm. So from the very beginning, you were already thinking about complex systems, and you were learning how to be flexible and nimble in working in such complicated environments. And that naturally has led to these opportunities in Los Alamos and has put you in a position where you're good at dealing with complicated problems that have many different factors. Would that be accurate?
Yes, but I have to say that the traditional training in computer science at that time was as you anticipated. You work with a few professors, work on a single problem, and make good progress on it. I think that training was very useful. But I think Los Alamos really opened the doors for me to start thinking on large problems. That's within the genetics and genetic
Of the
material of Los
place.
Alamos,
Yeah, right.
where people work in teams and solve large, complicated problems.
Right. I've had the opportunity to visit Los Alamos a number of times, and it's a funny place. As a kid, you first learn about Los Alamos because of the Manhattan Project. It was so important for this nation's history and the world history where the work goes on. I want to talk and turn to a very specific project. Is what I opened with, your work on COVID-19, because it's one of the very few challenges that the entire human population has faced together in such a visceral way. So can you tell us about what the Institute was doing in terms of COVID-19? What was it like, and what were the outcomes?
So before I get to COVID, let me step back and try to tell you a little bit about how we got there. The heart of our work lies in mathematical modeling. And we, as in school, think of mathematics as fairly simple algebra, solving set of equations at best.
Solve for X.
Solve for X. But mathematics is far more rich in the things that it can do. It really is at the heart of solving so many basic questions in epidemic processes, such as finding patient zero, understanding how to forecast the disease, understanding how best to distribute vaccines. These are all questions that are actually stated in fairly precise mathematical terms. And then the use of computing and mathematics can be brought to bear to solve these problems very effectively. Now, the way mathematics got introduced to epidemic science was the early work by Professor and Sir Ronald Ross. He was a pioneer, got the Nobel Prize for his work on essentially controlling malaria. And this was early 1900s. We didn't have computers then. Sir Ross was clearly influenced by the work in physics and chemistry that was going on. So he imagined epidemics through that lens. He thought of people and divided them into few compartments and thought of equivalent of reactions as these compartments interacting and producing infected individuals. Now that way of thinking about epidemic processes and spread is very valuable. It has been extended over these 100 years with remarkable success. But what it misses, Ken, is it misses all the complexity that is inherent in human systems. Our interactions with each other, the complex patterns we form from these interactions, our behaviors, how we adapt to these behaviors, the policies, all these issues just don't get easily captured in a traditional differential equation style modeling. So our group, since 2001, has been trying to develop a new theory of epidemic science. We call it networked epidemiology. And the basic hypothesis is that if you want to study epidemics well, you have to try and represent the underlying social contact network, the diversity in the way people interact with each other, not just to transmit diseases, but to transmit behaviors and other contagions. And this representation theory is likely to give us far more interesting insights than viewing this as simple compartmental models. Our paper in Nature in 2004 really established this field, and we have gone on to study epidemic science problems since then and supported virtually every large outbreak, from H1N1 outbreak to Ebola to Zika to MERS, and have done a number of case studies for the NIH, for the CDC, and the DoD.
Yeah, so this is fascinating, and we'll get to the COVID in a moment, but now that I think about it, in addition to the science that you can deploy in near real time for events that are happening. Your work, of course, provides very useful tools and models for what might happen. If there were a bio-terror attack, you could provide models that would indicate what the future could be, allowing policymakers to make the best informed decisions. So the work is that flexible, right?
Absolutely. Let me give you a quick example for it. In our Nature paper, we studied actually a biothreat event. And this particular study was posed as a question to us by the Office of Homeland Security. This was taken up just after the 9/11 event, and today it's 9/12, just a day after 9/11.
Right. So try to remember back then there were the anthrax letters that made it into the postal system, that also made it into Congress. So yeah, this is a very important problem.
That's right. And so the Office of Homeland Security department had not been established. General Lawler, who was the chief of staff, asked us the question of what would happen if there was a deliberate smallpox release in the population. Now, there was early work. There's an influential study in PNAS that had studied what the impact of a smallpox release would be. And that study articulated the need for mass vaccination. The problem is, it sounds like an interesting intervention, but most people in the US today are not vaccinated against smallpox before, and we do not know the impact of those vaccinations. Our study, because of the way we represented these populations, showed that a targeted vaccination and timely intervention is likely to be much more cost-effective, but also will be as effective in saving lives. That was the primary purpose of the study. So you're absolutely right. Biothreat events and planning for future pandemics is a central part of the work that we do over these years.
And now turning to COVID, not so long ago, what were you guys doing in your work?
Right. So in some ways, we were ready to tackle a pandemic question, right? Because we had studied all these questions before with various agencies. We had some inkling that a pandemic might happen as early as December, January of 2020.
Because of the news stories that were coming out of China.
Correct.
Right.
And our sponsors at DoD and at NIH started asking us questions on how we might come up with methods to address it. But when the outbreak became clear as a pandemic, we assembled a team of individuals, folks at the institute, folks at the university, and folks at other universities, including our colleagues at places like Princeton, UMD, Stanford, who all came together, and Virginia Tech, came together to address this question. And for 4 years, from 2020 January till 2024, we were actually working on this problem nonstop. It was an amazing effort by a team. Again, an example of transdisciplinary team science. We ended up studying questions that ranged from studying contact tracing processes to optimal allocation of vaccines, to studying what might happen if a certain set of school closures were put in place or facilities were closed. A couple of examples are worth giving here. Early in the pandemic, in about April, we worked with the Department of Health here in our Commonwealth. And our studies led to them not establishing what's called field hospitals. And the state ended up saving between $60 and $100 million because of the decision they made that day. We were the primary modeling group for the state from then on. We were also the primary modeling group for the DoD, worked with the CDC, NIH, with European CDC, and many other international organizations. Another interesting study that we did with the Indian Institute of Science in India and Google was to study the impact of early lockdowns in India using data from mobility maps that Google creates. After that, a little later, we also studied how India would actually restart their economy. And in particular, we were interested in studying how they would start opening up suburban trains in Mumbai. If you have traveled to India, you can imagine that the suburban trains can be amazing vectors for moving the disease, right? It's extremely packed. And so new questions about how to open the trains, how to cohort individuals in these trains became a central issue. So we had an amazing time where people worked really day and night to address important scientific and policy questions and supported our state, our university, and the world.
That's fascinating, Madhav. Thank you for your service. As someone locked down in my little house in the Belvedere community in Charlottesville, for me, most of the data that I saw about COVID was just restricted to what you saw in the news program. So it's with great pride to know that a lot of this much deeper policy-driven work was here. So thank you for doing that. Now, when I think about the nature of the questions that you consider, right, in the Biocomplexity Institute, that naturally leads me to the most complicated system that I can think of. And the most complicated system that I can think of is the union of all people on planet Earth, right? This is the most biocomplex system that I think most of us will ever deal with. And so do you think about that? Do you think about trying to model mankind, man's populations?
Indeed, we have thought about modeling the entire global population.
So let's talk about what that would mean to say that we're modeling the entire global population. So it's not just that here are all the countries on planet Earth and here are all the people and their numbers. It's much deeper than what you would get from a census. Maybe you could give us 2 or 3 examples of questions that would motivate and illustrate for us what it means to model people.
So one ubiquitous use of this, again, is infectious disease response. We build what's called social contact networks. These are networks in which nodes are people and edges or links are their interactions or social proximity. Now, in pandemics, you have multiple layers of these networks. There's a network on which the disease spreads. There's an information network in which people interact and share information. There's now the economic network on which economic transactions happen. You need to be able to model all these layers to try and support COVID response efforts. How do we go ahead and build these networks? There is no single place where this network exists. In fact, there is no way to measure endlessly in this world to build these networks. And it turns out the best way to do this is to do what's called synthesis of these networks. Or build what's called a digital twin of the system. We take data from various sources like census, trip diaries, travel surveys, data from providers that give us aggregate mobility patterns, behavioral patterns, and essentially fuse these data sets together to create these multi-layered networks. Just to give you a sense for how far we've come around, back in 1994-95, when we first started working on this topic, it would take us about 2 years to build such a network for a city. That time we did it for transport planning. Today, our group is able to build the entire social contact network for the US, which has got 300 million nodes and about 15 billion interactions in less than a day. It's an amazing testimony to the team's work that they have done over these last 25 years.
And what makes that possible? Computers are just better?
It's actually possible for multiple reasons. Computers have gotten faster. In today's world, just our iPhone is faster than the largest supercomputer that Pentagon used for much of the design decisions in 1980s. But beyond computers, there's been significant progress in AI and mathematics. So the methods we use can be viewed as generative AI techniques, something we are very, very familiar with today's world, where people are able to produce images and text. These are producing networks. But instead of just creating these images and text purely on data, they also try and use social and behavioral theories to augment it, because for scientific problems, there's not enough measured data to try and use generative methods in isolation. Along with it, of course, the amount of data that is available has changed. Back in 94, 95, we had to use phone books literally to understand where people might be living. Today, much of this data is available at our fingertips.
So in terms of these technical advances, there's the ability to carry out more complicated, more detailed calculations in a much shorter time frame. But that doesn't mean that today making ideal or accurate predictions is easy. What are the challenges that you still face despite these technological advances?
Ken, the digital twin concept is an interesting one, and I sort of just recall that you've been building interesting digital twins in your own life too, with the work you've done with the swimming team and other sports. So the concept of digital twin is really pervasive, and I was really, absolutely stunned to see how you have used it in your work. This is just a much larger digital twin that is used in particular settings. But digital twin alone is not enough. You need these massive simulations to study dynamics.
You have to be able to use them, right?
You have to be able to use them.
Right.
You have to be able to represent policies. You
Right.
have to be able to represent the dynamical processes on it. And applied mathematicians and computer scientists have built simulations of physical systems, and these are contagion processes that we need to simulate. So this required, again, high-performance computing work. Just to give you an example, during the 4 years of COVID response, we used our own HPC supercomputing systems here at UVA, which were very useful, but also used NSF supercomputing centers and consumed over 30 million CPU hours to do these calculations. A remarkable feat, again, for these calculations. Now, going back to the challenges, there are many challenges, some that are old challenges, I would say, and some challenge that I did not even anticipate before we started working on COVID. The first challenge is that of forecast. Turns out that forecasting epidemic dynamics, which is a central question everybody wants to know, is non-trivial and is quite different than, say, forecasting weather or forecasting planetary motions. It's much closer to
planetary motion. I feel like that's solved.
Right. This problem, I would say, is closer to forecasting markets. And an economist would say, through the efficient market hypothesis, that you cannot forecast market dynamics, right? You can only understand potentially long-term trends. Epidemics have the same problem because the forecast itself become endogenous to the system. They can change what people can do with the forecast and adapt their behavior and render the forecast either true or false, depending on how they react. So that's the first challenge one needs to solve. And one needs to agree that these forecasts over long periods are simply not going to be quite accurate. They're likely to work on short time space. The second challenge, because of this, these forecasts really work better during stable periods. They are really around averages. What people are very interested in is the tails of these distributions, as one would call. And that remains a challenge for all of us. In fact, I would argue that the community as a whole was not able to forecast sudden and unexpected changes and transitions to the epidemic dynamics during the COVID-19 pandemic. And what it tells us is that we need more data to do this better. It doesn't mean that forecasting should not be done. It just means that we need to improve the methodology and the data that we collect. The same thing happened actually during weather, when the first weather models were using for prediction in 1950s. The second challenge that I think is relatively new is how important the role of information as well as misinformation and disinformation is in the spread and control of pandemics. In fact, I would argue that pandemics could have been controlled relatively straightforwardly if we were all going to be staying at home and stay at home for 50 days and let the disease pass. But that doesn't happen, right? There's a notion of lack of trust that also came into picture that posed new challenges for modeling. People, after a brief period, were somewhat apprehensive about the policies that government was promulgating in certain cases. These challenges need to be modeled. These issues need to be tackled as a society, and we need to better understand them when we produce these models effectively.
Madhav, this has been a great conversation. I love the math. I love the central importance of using mathematics, technology, so on and so forth, to make the world a better place in terms of planning for things like spread of disease or terror threats, so on and so forth. I want to circle back to one thing that you mentioned, the role of AI. We're all talking about AI. There's quite a bit of anxiety, but also excitement with the emergence of this technology. How has AI opened up and influenced your work in the Institute kind of in a more visual way?
It's a great question. It has fundamentally changed how we do some of the work in our institute, Ken. Just as a few examples, as we discussed, we are in the business of creating digital twins for large-scale systems. These are really generative AI techniques. One of the things that AI has done is the speed and the depth with which these digital twins can be constructed. But it also created challenges now because we are not sure the data that we are using is real or manipulated. And this affects the processes that we use in creating digital twins.
And let's be clear here, there's essentially no such thing as a large data set that isn't contaminated in some way.
That is exactly right.
Just does not exist.
Doesn't exist. And so understanding what the contamination is or what the weaknesses are is a central part. So on one hand, we have these data sets which we are going to use to synthesize our digital twins, but we need to be much more thoughtful. But flipping this around, generative AI techniques for, say, creating images or movies is as hard a problem it is relatively easy for today's techniques because of the amount of data that is available. If you start applying similar principles in science and engineering, you soon realize that you just don't have enough data. And we are actually already starting to realize as a scientific community that these large AI models are going to run out of data to train themselves in about a year or two. So our synthetic data, or the digital twins, can actually be turned around and can be used along with the scenario modeling work we talked about before in the context of COVID and other infrastructures to start training these generative AI methods to then create new kinds of systems. So you're both a consumer of the AI technology to create better twins, but then you're a producer of data, synthetic data, that can be used for next generation of science and engineering applications. So that's one interesting place where we are using AI and leveraging it. The other part is much more philosophical in a certain sense. AI has actually reignited a debate of what cognition is. We have been working on building decision support tools for our sponsors all these years. In the end, these tools that we have built are used to make decisions or analyze decisions. AI tech systems that we build can be thought of as, first, cognitive augmentations. They augment the ability of the decision maker to make better decisions. But there's a new concept in what's called the extended mind hypothesis, where these tools can actually be thought of extensions, cognitive extensions. They expand your ability to do certain things. You have yourself used AI to now work on certain interesting mathematical theorems that has got elements of augmentation, but extensions, because you might have brought to fore techniques that you might not have even imagined, but AI helped you work on it, right? So this notion of extensions and augmentation is becoming a central portion of this. And when you start talking about collective decision-making, which is what is happening today, AI is playing a role of being this mediating environment. All these agents that are going to be able to support, say, during a crisis event, a mayor, a public health official, a school teacher, all of them are essentially making decisions in a distributed manner. And this AI fabric that we are creating is going to start playing a bigger and bigger role in influencing how these decisions are made.
That's right. And since you brought up that I use large language models as a research assistant, maybe I'll offer a small public service announcement. When you use a large language model, a chatbot, say ChatGPT-5, if you're a user and you're a listener, look into the settings. If you look into your personal settings, you can fine-tune your model so that your model is trained on everything that you might be conversing with your model. You can also set your privacy settings so that the model doesn't train itself to be used outside your private communications. So these are things that are happening, as Madhav says. And I bring this up because there are other privacy and ethics questions that, as a personal user, you should be aware of. So time is running short. This is great. We could talk quite a bit longer, but we do need to wrap up, Madhav. So I have just 2 questions left. The first is for students, graduate students and postdocs here at UVA. If they want to become involved with the Biocomplexity Institute, how could they do that?
Just recently, like a week back, we moved into new spaces. And I think that's going to be hugely influential in how we engage folks.
Yeah, so you're no longer
We are no
by
longer
the airport.
at the airport. We actually are in the Dairy Market building, very close to the ground, walkable from the rotunda, walkable to the medical school. The Democracy Lab is very close.
UVA Ventures.
UVA Ventures is very close.
The bike shop.
The NSDPI that our colleague Phil runs is very, very close. So first of all, the location is going to make a big impact in how we interact with folks. It was to some extent challenging for individuals to come and visit us there. But we are also taking the chance now that COVID is over. We have finished the work that we were doing for all the federal agencies and the state agencies. We are starting to pivot back into a deeper engagement with the community, local community here. We are working with students. We are thinking about various seminar series, podcasts, 2 big programs on computing for global challenges and P4GC preparing for global challenges that are all going to be a part of this.
And for those that are interested, do they go to your website? Should they send you an email?
Yes, so they can visit the Biocomplexity website, or they can send me or others in the group an email, and we'll be very happy to engage them.
Perfect. Okay, last question. I ask all of my guests a question about their path, their journey. Sometimes it's a fun fact. Sometimes it's a story about an event or perhaps a person that inspired them early in life that set them on their personal journey that ends up here at UVA. Your personal story.
My personal story actually is quite related to what I'm doing today, Ken. I was born and brought up in a small town in India called Bhopal. It's a capital of the state of Madhya Pradesh. It's right in the middle of the country. I had an excellent childhood, enjoyed the time there. But when I just finished my high school and I was starting to go to college, we had one of the biggest, if not the biggest, industrial disasters in the world. It was called the Bhopal gas tragedy. There's a very poisonous gas, methyl isocyanide, that got released from a Union Carbide plant in downtown Bhopal. And in many ways, although I was lucky and the folks around me were lucky because the wind took that gas in a different direction, we lost a lot of lives, Ken, that day. And it left a lasting impression on me.
If I remember correctly, I was in high school. I remember that made world news. This industrial leak, it was insidious. It happened at night when people were asleep.
That is correct. People were asleep. They didn't have good information. Many people ran out, and that actually caused more trouble because they essentially took the gas in and died. And the effects are being felt even today, after all these years, after 1984 when it happened. People have lost eyesight. They have breathing problems, mental health problems. It left a lasting impression on me. And in some ways, I really felt that there has to be a way for science to try and come up with solutions that can avoid or at least mitigate disasters as much as possible. Now, of course, I was naive. I did not realize that people were working on these problems. But in many ways, the work that I've been doing since then on disaster management and response reflects this influential event that happened in my life long time back.
Wow, that's powerful, Madhav. Thank you for sharing that. This has been a great discussion. Under your guidance, the Biocomplexity Institute is one of our gems, one of our most exciting institutes here at the University of Virginia. Thank you for joining me today in conversation. And I'm Ken Ono, STEM advisor to the provost, and the Marvin Rosenblum Professor of Mathematics, and you've been listening to Who's in STEM.
Who's in STEM is a production of WTJU 91.1 FM and the Office of the Provost at the University of Virginia. Who's in STEM is produced by Benjamin Larson, Katie Nichols, and Ria Verma. Our music is composed and performed by Robert Schneider and John Ferguson of Apples and Stereo. Follow us on Instagram, listen and subscribe to Who's in STEM on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back soon with another conversation about scientific and technological innovation at the university.